Okay, today's lecture is titled The Road to the Constitution. So far we have talked about different types of government, different types of economies, and we've talked a little bit about some of the important ideas, right, that shaped our thinking, right? Popular sovereignty and rule of law and those things. Today we're going to really start channeling that more towards how did that impact the formation of our government, okay? How did that put us on the road to the U.S. Constitution, which is the document that sets up our government. And as you can tell from your lecture outline, we're going to be talking about kind of 5 major topics: colonial experiences, state constitution, the Articles of Confederation. We'll talk about the Constitutional Convention, and we'll talk a little bit about the ratification debate, okay? The argument between groups over should we ratify or should we approve the Constitution. So we're going to start with going back to before we were a country, going back to our colonial experiences, okay? And arguably, in our colonial experiences, the thing that prepared us best to govern ourselves as a country was our local self-government as colonies. That should probably be your first bullet point. Local self-government. Now, what about local self-government? Okay. Starting all the way back in 1619 with the Virginia House of Burgesses. We talked about this in 10th grade. There was a tradition of the American colonists governing themselves. So our local self-government goes all the way back to 1619 and the Virginia House of Burgesses. This was the very first representative assembly, elected assembly, in the American colonies. And it established the idea that in America, the government should be based on the will of the people. Another important early event, in this case document, that contributed to governing ourselves was the Mayflower Compact. And this was the first written constitution in the colonies. So going all the way back almost to the very founding of the American colonies, we have this tradition of the people having an important role in the government, right? And we have this idea of we need to write down, we need a written framework or constitution so that it's very clear. This is how things are going to work. Okay? Building from that, just about every colony out of the 13, almost all of the colonies, set up a democratic system of government with 3 branches. almost all of the colonies had a very similar government, a democratic system of government where power was split into 3 different branches. Oh gosh, that sounds awful familiar, doesn't it? Right? You can start to see that these colonial experiences impacted us as we decided what our new national government would look like. Now, it wasn't exactly what we have today, because you did have, most of the colonies had a royal governor who was not elected by the people, right? He was chosen by the king. And the royal governor had most of the power. But we were given some, we as colonists were given some of the decision-making power. And that was important to us. Another piece of our colonial experience that helped us out was the fact that every colony had its own militia. What is a militia? Kind of, right?
Like Minutemen.
Yeah, the Minutemen were an example of a militia. Is it a trained professional army?
No.
No, it's basically a volunteer fighting force, right? But the fact that each colony had its own militia gave us the confidence that we could rule ourselves without Britain's help. Right? So that played an important role in pushing us towards independence and pushing us towards starting our own government. We felt, you know, we don't need Great Britain to defend us. We have our own militias. We have the confidence to defend ourselves. I'll put an S there because it's more than one, right? Each colony had its own, you know, kind of each town, oftentimes. The third important concept from our colonial experiences that really helped push us down the road to the Constitution was something called benign neglect. The concept of benign neglect. What does neglect mean?
Ignore.
Yeah, to leave alone, to ignore. And most of the times we think of neglect as what? Good thing or bad thing?
Bad.
It's a bad thing, right? Child neglect, that's bad. And it is, okay? But this word benign,
He's harmless.
harmless, right? So harmless neglect. Benign neglect is the idea that Great Britain, our parent country, largely left us alone during the colonial period. Great Britain largely left us alone. Why do you think they would do that? Exactly right. They're thousands of miles away, right? So we're so far away that they pretty much just left us alone. And that gave us the ability to make our own decisions, to make our own rules. Of course, the king, the king was still the king, and we were still subjects. But they pretty much said, yeah, I mean, you guys just kind of stay out of trouble, but we'll let you do what you want. And we got used to that. We got comfortable making our own rules. Now, what causes that to change, that benign neglect? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Taxes, right? It's the taxes. After the French and Indian War, which is a very costly war for Great Britain, they started putting those taxes in place on the American colonies. And we resented it. We felt like, hey, hang on. For 100 years now, we've been able to make our own decisions, and now you're going back and changing the rules. We don't like that. So that leads to the American Revolution. And there you have it, 150 years of colonial history in 8 minutes.
I wish that happened 2 years ago.
Pipe down over there. I can do it in 8 minutes because we took a lot longer 2 years ago. The analogy I often use with students is, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, you get your first car, you have that independence and freedom, and your parents trust you, and they're like, hey, you know, you can make your own decisions, I trust you. And then without you really doing anything wrong, all of a sudden, they come back. And they say, you know, yeah, I know you've been kind of having that independence and doing your own thing, but new rules, right? From now on, you have to be back home by no later than 7:30. You also have to pay for your own gas and insurance, right? And if you want the car, I hold the keys, and if you want it, you need to give me written reasons why. Like, whoa, I'm not okay with that, right? You changed the rules, and I'm not okay with that. That's a very overly simplistic analogy of kind of what the colonists felt like. We were making our own rules, and everything was fine. Now you're going back and changing it. And you're taxing us without us even having a say, and we don't like that. So these different colonial experiences kind of pushed us farther down the road to a new nation and a new government. All right, so let's move on to our second major topic. Revolution happens, we win. There you go. Look at that. The revolution in 4 seconds. Well, once we declare our independence, right, we no longer have 13 colonies under the rule of the king. We now have 13 separate states. And so one of the first things they did was each state wrote its own state constitution. And these became models we would use when we wrote a national constitution. So a couple things that kind of apply to this idea of state constitutions. First off, they reflect the idea that we as Americans felt government should be based on some basic ideas that were spelled out in a written constitution. I'll say that again. We as Americans felt that government should be based on some basic ideas or principles that were spelled out in a written constitution. Why is it important to write it down?
So they can't change it?
Not that you can't change it.
So everyone knows what the rules are.
Right. Everybody knows, right? Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be any confusion, right? If we look at the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, boy, there's a lot of debate over what that means, okay? But what you can't argue is that we do have the right to bear arms. It's written, right? So we said, you know, hey, we're going to put these down in writing so it's clear, right? Similarities between each of our state constitutions. They all had some of the same basic ideas, right? They each, again, this goes back to the assessment we did yesterday, some of those ideas we talked about. Every single state constitution had the idea of popular sovereignty. The idea that the people are the source of power. They each had limited government. The government was not all powerful. They each had the rule of law. And they each were based on majority rule. That's one we haven't talked about. These other ones are ones we've already discussed. The people are the source of power. Government has limits. No one is above the law. And majority rule is pretty straightforward. What do you think that means?
the bigger group gets the say.
Right. Okay. If it's going to be based on the will of the people, well, we're going to vote, and whichever group gets the most wins. Okay. Now, along with majority rule is this concept of minority rights. So that means the majority, just because you won, doesn't mean you can just trample all over the group that lost. Okay? But they all established that, hey, you know, whoever gets the most votes wins. All of the 13 state constitutions separated power into 3 branches, and they all included some sort of Bill of Rights. They all split power into 3 branches, and they all had a written Bill of Rights of some sort. They didn't always call it a Bill of Rights, but basically what it was. I think we would agree that all of these are positives, right? That we've grown up in a system that does these and we feel they're good ideas. However, not everything about the state constitutions was positive. There were some negatives. Okay? For example, all of the state constitutions at first permitted human slavery. Most students will go, no, that's not true. What about up north? Yeah, they allowed it. The 10th grade course, we're talking about slavery right now and how, you know, those New England colonies, they allowed it. It went away quickly because they didn't have a demand for it, right? Which helps explain why the North abolished slavery much faster than the South did, but they allowed it. And they also restricted voting rights to wealthy white male landowners. Every single one of them. Restricted voting rights to wealthy white male landowners. So those are the state constitutions, right? But you can already see there's some things in that we're going to look to as models for our national government. Hopefully you guys also remember from 2 years ago, unless you slept through that part, that the Constitution was not our first national government. What was our first? We read about this last night too, I think. The Articles of Confederation. So we talked a little bit about state constitutions. Our third major topic is to talk about the first national government of the United States, the Articles of Confederation. So in the first assessment we did, we talked about federal versus unitary versus confederal. We said in a unitary system, the one national government gets all the power. And it might allow states or regions to have a little bit of say, but it's the top dog, national government. And that's what we had under the king. Parliament and king had total power. The colonies could say, we don't like this, but the king and parliament could say, tough, deal with it. So if that's what we despised and we really didn't like it, and that's on one extreme, it makes sense that we would say, that really sucked. We want to go all the way to the other side. And we want a confederal system, where the national government is very weak and the state governments are very strong. So that's what we did, right? We wrote up the Articles of Confederation. This was the first national government of the United States, and it established a very weak national government. And gave most of the power to the states. What's that?
No wonder why it didn't work.
Well, we're going to talk about that.
There's some people that still plead some of the stuff in the Articles of Confederation.
You mean that they like the ideas of it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
they'll be like, if they're pulling, it's like, oh no, not in the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly people today, and I mean, and really, this idea of who should have the power, right? This division between state government and national government. How powerful should the national government be? That honestly, if you were to narrow down one essential question that has been a driving question throughout the entire history of our national government, it's that. What is the proper role of the national government? Should it be big and strong? Should it be weak and let the states do most? Or should it be somewhere in between? That question we are still debating today. Right? You will see there are going to be 4 debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And just about in every single one, you're going to see the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, saying we need to have the national government do more to solve problems. And Donald Trump, presumably, will say, who knows what he's say, but presumably will argue, no, the national government should not be so strong, right? We need to let the states settle more. It's the same question our founding fathers dealt with. So they first settled on the Articles of Confederation, very weak national government. The national government had no executive branch and no judicial branch. So it was a one-branch national government. All it had was a very weak Congress. The national government was given some power. It could declare war, for example. It was given some power, but it was not allowed to tax. And so if it's not allowed to tax, what does that mean?
No money.
No money. The national government was constantly broke. It was also not allowed to regulate trade between the 13 states. So the 13 states bickered and fought with each other a lot. And the national government couldn't do anything about it. So in the end, the weakness of the national government was its undoing. The national government proved too weak to defend the country. And the event that really showed that was Shays Rebellion. And I'm not going to go into tremendous detail about Shays Rebellion. But essentially you had an uprising in Massachusetts of angry citizens, and Massachusetts needed help. And the national government was too weak to do anything to put it down. Now, obviously, the rebellion was eventually put down, okay? But it just showed, hang on, something's wrong here. We have made the national government too weak. We can't, it's not even strong enough to defend the country. We need to do some changing. So, moving on to our 4th main topic, the Constitutional Convention. The call goes out, at first, not to write a whole new government, but actually to revise the Articles of Confederation. They said, hey, let's make some changes. And so the states send representatives to revise the Articles of Confederation. But it very quickly becomes clear that a lot of people there don't want to revise it, they want to throw it away. and start new. Not everybody's wild about that. Some people walked out, right? Some people like Sam Adams, not the beer maker, right? The actual Sam Adams. He walked out. He felt states should have the power. Patrick Henry from Virginia, right? Give me liberty or give me death. Walked out. Famously said, "I smell a rat." Right? Something's wrong here. I don't like it. And he left. They said, "Okay, fine. We'll move on without you." And we're going to read, a little bit about this and talk about it a bit more. So I'm not going to go into tremendous detail here because we're limited by time. But the delegates to the Constitutional Convention decide to set up a new system of government that's going to be based on a federal system. So we're going to get rid of the Confederation, the confederal system, and we're going to set up a new government based on a federal system. We're going to have a stronger national government, but one that will share power with the states. So we had unitary with England. We didn't like it. We went full tilt the other way with the Articles of Confederation. It was a disaster, and they said the Constitution is going to be in the middle, a federal system. Right? The national government will be stronger, but the states will have some power too. And for this lecture, I want to talk about the importance of compromise, because there are really three major compromises that we need to know about that went into creating the Constitution. Otherwise, if any one of these had not been worked out, the whole thing could have fallen apart. So we're going to talk about three main compromises here. The first one was on representation. And again, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail because you're going to read about these. I'm going to have you fill out a chart to go into your notes. But we need to understand these are the important compromises here. The question for representation was basically, how will the states be represented? Right? Is it going to be equal? Or will it be based on population? That was the key question. How are the states going to be represented? Is it going to be equal, or will it be based on population? And the solution came to be known as the Great Compromise. And again, just surface level right now, just giving you the information. We'll go deeper as we read in the textbook and fill in some charts. But basically, the solution was, we'll have a little bit of both. We will set up a two-house Congress. One of them, the states will be equal, and in the other, it'll be based on population. Pretty logical, right? Both sides get a little bit of what they want. The Great Compromise. We're going to have a two-house Congress. One house will be equal. The other will be based on population. So once you establish that, you have another whole argument that breaks out over slavery. The main question there was, well, if you're going to base it on population, would slaves count as part of the population? Right? So they argue and argue and argue over this. Southern states say yes, northern states say no. And the compromise for this one is the infamous 3/5 compromise, which said 3/5 of the slaves will be added to your population. It shouldn't say compromise is, it should just say compromise. One compromise. The 3/5 compromise. They'll count 3/5 of the slave population. The third major compromise was over who would pick the president. Who's going to pick the president? Some people said the American people. Just like we choose our representatives. We should vote, and whoever gets the most gets to be president. Other people said, no, I think maybe it should be more like a parliamentary system, where Congress gets to pick the president. Some people even said we need a council. It's too much power for one person. We need 2 or 3 heads of the executive branch. The solution, the compromise, was that we're just going to have one, and that president would be selected by a special body called the Electoral College. And I am not going to go into that right now because we could spend the entire class diagramming the Electoral College and how it works, and you would all look at me like I have 6 heads. But for right now, just introducing these ideas, these compromises to you. We will go into more detail. So they hammer out these compromises, and that's important to understand, guys, because compromise today is unfortunately treated like a bad word. If you're a Republican and you dare compromise and work with a Democrat, you're like a bad guy, right? That's almost the way it's seen, because things have gotten so polarized. But it's important to remember, our entire nation is built on compromise, going all the way back to the Constitutional Convention. Without these compromises, the whole thing falls apart. Okay? So compromise was important. So they work it out. They work out these compromises. They come up with a constitution. Awesome. Hooray. We've got a new government. Except not quite. Okay? Because we still need to ratify the Constitution, which brings us to our 5th main topic, the ratification battle. So just because a bunch of dudes sat down in Philadelphia and wrote up a document doesn't mean it automatically became the new government of the nation. It had to go out to the states, and the states had to vote on it. And they decided that it would require 9 of the 13 states. As soon as 9 states said, we want the Constitution, it would go into effect. And the technical word is ratify, which just simply means to approve. So they send copies of the Constitution out to the 13 states, and they're all going to have an election, a special meeting to decide, are we going to do this? And a big battle breaks out, not like a literal armed battle, but a publicity battle between 2 main groups. The Federalists were the group who wanted to support the Constitution. They were in favor of it. The Federalists go out and they are making arguments, they're giving speeches, they're holding debates. They are the ones arguing for the Constitution. They're trying to convince America this is a better government. And then, opposing them, cleverly named, the Anti-Federalists. And they are the ones who are against it. They are against the Constitution. And what do you think their big beef is?
They want the states to have power.
Yeah, they think that the Constitution gives too much power to the national government. They want the states to have most of the power. They're also very concerned that originally the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights. They're worried the national government's too strong and there's no Bill of Rights to protect the citizens. So, this is good timing. It's almost Constitution Day. September 17th is Constitution Day. So the battle goes on in each of the 13 states between these two groups. Several states quickly ratify the Constitution, and then it kind of stalls out over this issue of the Bill of Rights. No Bill of Rights. That bothers me. So long story short, again, we'll go into more detail later, but long story short, once the Constitution, the debate is settled, once the Federalists decide that they are going to add a Bill of Rights, they agree to add a Bill of Rights, then a lot of the anti-Federalists not really go over, but they agree to ratify the Constitution. Once the Federalists agree to add a Bill of Rights, the anti-Federalists give in and say, okay, as long as you promise to put a Bill of Rights in, we will go with it. And the Constitution is adopted and goes into effect in 1789.